Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are returning to the summer of 2006 and taking a look for the very first time at a Cyber-Stein deck. So Cyber-Stein decks during the summer of 2006 and then into the fall of 2006 had a few different pathways. You could really build your deck, one, fully committed to the OTK. I'm talking about maxing 3 Steins, 3 Giant Trinades, 3 Megamorphs, obviously the one copy of limiter removal, and then typically playing a lot of stall cards to support that game plan. Even potentially running cards like Poison the Old Man and Emergency Provisions to gain life points in order to still pay for Cyber-Stein if you drop below the threshold of 5,000. That was one pathway. That's not what we're going to do today. Instead, we're going to talk about the second pathway, which was popular during the summer of 2006 and then even a little bit into the fall, which is to devote a reasonable amount of main deck space, maybe 2 copies of Cyber-Stein, for example, maybe 2 copies of Giant Trinade, but incorporate, instead of stall cards, the traditional monsters that you would see in a Chaos deck. I'm talking about Chaos Sorcerer, Zaborg the Thunder Monarch, even cards like Magician of Faith, Book of Moon, and making it such that you had really 2 game plans. The first game plan was just to win the game naturally. You never draw Stein, maybe use Giant Trinade instead to push through damage, maybe use limiter removal to push through damage, and you're not really planning on winning through Stein, but then also having a few combinations of cards that can allow you to deal 8,000 damage through Cyber-Stein and take the game early in the first few turns. But then even have a sort of a third game plan, a plan C, which is play a traditional game, chip away damage, pressure your opponent by having Stein in the deck with the amount of commitments that you've made to playing multiple Steins and Megamorph and Trinade, and make it so that in the first couple turns, every little bit of damage counts. You know, if you get an attack directly in with Zaborg, now all of a sudden you don't really need to draw Stein with Megamorph. It allows you to, instead of devote yourself to fully committing to Stein and Megamorph being drawn together, make it such that Stein alone can actually deal enough damage to win. Not 8,000 damage all at once, which is what people typically think of when they look at Cyber-Stein, but deal enough damage to maximize the efficiency of reaching 8,000 without having to devote all of these main deck spots to cards that have really narrow applications. You know, if you use Chaos Sorcerer, Cyber Dragon, Breaker the Magical Warrior, Snatch Steal to chip away damage, it might not feel like the traditional OTK where you go Giant Trinade, Stein, pay 5,000, bring out Cyber Twin, Megamorph and attack for it. It might not feel like that, but it is still a deck devoted to Stein, where on turn 3, 4, or 5, after you've chipped away, let's say 3,000, 4,000 life points, the Stein is what puts it over the top. The Stein is what allows you to win. So it's not a combo of Stein, Trinade, Megamorph. It's a combination of Stein, maybe Decree, maybe Trinade, maybe Heavy Storm, and then just having a deck filled with cards that can chip away damage naturally and make it so that you actually have 2 really strong game plans. You can win naturally, never have to worry about Stein, or early on in the turns, you can draw Cyber-Stein after having already chipped away damage and win the game there. You theoretically could also still draw Trinade, Limiter, Stein. You could actually still draw the combination of cards that deal 8,000 all in one turn, but that's not the full commitment here. And it was a deck that saw a reasonable amount of success during the summer of 2006, right? A format dominated by all the variations of Chaos that we've talked about. Actually had multiple occasions where players top-8'd Shonen Jump championships with the strategy that we're going to look at, a Cyber-Stein pseudo-Chaos deck. This deck had at least 3 top 8 spots that come to mind. There was Robert Morgan, Cesar Gonzalez, and Corey Fabish. I've decided today to profile Corey's exact deck, primarily because he actually commented on Facebook about his deck when I was profiling this format. So I feel a little bit obligated to profile his deck card for card. So I'll try to go into what I think was his reasoning, some of the logic behind his card choices, main, side, and extra, everything all today. But without further ado, let's take our first deep dive look at a Cyber-Stein deck that's not fully committed to the OTK, but absolutely still has the potential to win the game, maybe instead on turn 4, with none other than Cyber-Stein. All right, we're going to start the deck profile off with 3 copies of Cyber Dragon. Cyber Dragon contributes to quick damage outputs, right? This deck isn't entirely devoted to the actual OTK, and as a result, you need to find ways to chip damage as the game progresses and potentially open up a Cyber-Stein that doesn't require limiter removal or Megamorph, and as a result, Cyber Dragon's really useful in doing that. It's also a light monster, which contributes to Chaos Sorcerer, and in addition to that, you technically can open up the combination of Cyber Dragon, Zaborg, Last Will, which is 8,000 damage onto an open board, and I'll talk a little bit about that play as we get going. So 3 copies of Cyber Dragon. It's also a machine monster, and this deck does run limiter removal. Then we have 3 copies of Nimble Mamanga. Nimble Mamanga was really common in Cyber-Stein decks. Obviously, it gains life points. It's one of the, I guess, best life gain monsters or life gain cards out there. If your deck is fully devoted to the OTK, you might run cards like Poison of the Old Man and Emergency Provisions, which can sometimes gain several thousand life points in one big chain where you play Poison the Old Man, Emergency Provision, send them to the grave, and next thing you know, you not only gained enough life points to pay for a single Cyber-Stein, you may have actually been able to pay for 2. Nimble Mamanga works a little bit like that. The problem with Nimble Mamanga is if you crash it in order to special summon 2 more, the other 2 that come out are going to be in defense mode, so it's not like you can triple crash into something, and if you're crashing, you're going to be losing life points anyway. So in the real world, you're going to set this, your opponent will attack into it, you'll gain 1,000 life points, and you'll at least clog the field, right? Dealing with face-down defense position monsters isn't impossible. This format has Zaborg, Nobleman, Exiled Forest, DD Warrior Lady, and others. So it's not inconceivable that your opponent can deal with the other 2, but it could clog the field up, give you a little bit of life points to put you above the 5,000 threshold, and at the bare minimum, slow the game down, right? If Nimble Mamanga gives you 1 or 2 more draw phases, that could be enough to win the game. So triple Nimble Mamanga and then triple Dekoichi. The Dekoichis are really there for a couple different reasons. 1, it's a dark. This deck does have Chaos Sorcerer, both in the main and side. 2, it's a machine, so it combines with machine cards like Cyber Dragon and Limiter Removal. In addition to that, it draws a card, which digs you closer to the actual OTK, or honestly just digs you closer to power cards. And beyond all that, it's just a generically powerful card. This deck, as I commented on during the introduction, is going to hedge between the OTK and just being a Chaos deck. Dekoichi is a perfect card that satisfies both the Chaos strategy and the Machine strategy and the OTK strategy. Now we have the 2 of, so this deck's only going to run 2 copies of Cyber-Stein. Cyber-Stein was at 3, you could have run a full 3 copies, but again, this deck is hedging between the OTK and being a Chaos deck, so it's only going to run 2 copies of Cyber-Stein, hoping to prolong the game, not just try and draw Cyber-Stein on the opening turn, tutor it out with Sangan, draw into it through Dekoichis, and again, if you never draw Cyber-Stein, you can easily win the game. So you don't actually need to draw Cyber-Stein in this particular deck. That was the beauty of it. We have 2 copies of Magician of Faith. It's a light monster. It's just a power card during the format. A lot of good spells. Being able to buy back something like Limiter Removal can obviously win you the game out of nowhere. Maybe early in the game you had to use a True Nade or a Heavy Storm to push through damage, and now you get it back. Light monster, like I commented on. Perfect card to hedge between the OTK and actually being a Chaos deck. And then we have some one-ofs. We have Morphing Jar. It's not a card that was overwhelmingly popular in Chaos decks because it's not a light or a dark, and there's sort of a lot of flip effects already in the format, but it does dig you closer to OTKs. Drawing 5 fresh cards in this deck could really mean a couple different things. 1, you orchestrated a game state where it's just a card advantage play, or 2, you just drew into an OTK, so it really fits both strategies quite well. We have a Sangan to search out Cyber-Stein, but also just a bunch of other monsters. Reaper, which stalls the game, is a dark monster, and also is a perfect hedge between the OTK and the return deck, or the Chaos deck. We have Breaker, which is basically a staple at this point. We have 2 big monsters. We have 1 Chaos Sorcerer and 1 Zaborg. We'll be signing more copies of both of these. But again, in this first game, we're going to be trying to really play right down the middle. We've got 2, not 3 Cyber-Steins. We only have 1 Sork and 1 Zaborg. So we're not really committing entirely to the Chaos package or entirely to the Stein package. We're kind of going right down the middle, which is what hopefully you see here in this monster lineup. And then 1 copy of Exiled Forest. Exiled Forest is really good because it combines perfectly with Last Will. Last Will, Exiled Forest allows you to clear a monster and then summon Cyber-Stein theoretically onto a clear field. I know it's not a light or a dark, but it was typically one of the cards that you would run in Cyber-Stein decks just because of the inclusion of Last Will. But here we are. That's our monster lineup. Corey elected to run a heavy spell lineup and cut back on the trap. So this wasn't necessarily standard, but I think in this particular build, when you decide to run heavy spells, that means you often run Royal Decree. So I'll spoil that now. We're going to run Royal Decree. So we have to counteract the fact that we don't have a lot of defensive trap cards by running quick plays like Enemy Controller. Enemy Controller is a really good card when you're running a deck like Cyber-Stein because you can Stein and then Enemy Controller away the Stein to take control of an opponent's monster. And then whether you have Cyber Twin Dragon or Cyber End Dragon, and maybe you've already chipped away damage, you can just win the game out of nowhere. And Enemy Controller is just a generically powerful card. This deck's not going to have Scapegoats or Treeborn Frog in the main deck to combine with this, but it's still just a good defensive card that has a little bit more application than Book of Moon. Yes, we have flip effects we wouldn't mind resetting, but Enemy Controller can open up wins out of nowhere with Cyber-Stein. 2 copies of Nobleman of Crossout, which is good for clearing the field, just a generically powerful card. We have only 2 copies of Giant True Nade. We could have run 3, but again, this deck's not devoted entirely to the OTK, and we combine that with Heavy Storm. MST, and then actually having 2 Royal Decrees, make it that we already have 6 back row clearing cards. We don't really need to commit fully to triple Giant Trunade. It's going to clog. We're going to lose games that we might otherwise win if they were just cards that actually did something. You know, if you have double Heavy Storm and Giant Trunade and you didn't actually draw Stein, it's not really going to do much. We have Confiscation and Graceful Charity. Confiscation's an interesting one. In the traditional OTK deck, you really wouldn't run Confiscation. There's the life point issue. But in this deck, you're going to play a lot of games that use Summon Stein and don't intend on actually winning that turn. And being able to see your opponent's hand and ensure that your Cyber-Stein is actually going to not only survive but not cost you the game can be pretty valuable, right? You take your opponents out to Cyber End Dragon. A 4,000 trample is actually really difficult, or 4,000 piercing, sorry, using Magic terminology. But a 4,000 piercing with Cyber End Dragon can be really difficult to deal with. So Confiscation has a role of just being a power card. This deck's not fully committed to the OTK. This deck might draw Stein without the OTK pieces. And as a result, Confiscation actually has a place in this deck. Next, you have 1 copy of Book of Moon, combining with the enemy controllers to at least give us some defensive quick plays. We have just some power cards at the time: Premature Burial, Snatch Steal. We also have Creature Swap. Creature Swap's an interesting one because this deck doesn't actually have a ton of recruiters in the traditional sense. It has Nimble Mamanga, which is technically 1, right? You can swap your opponent a Nimble Mamanga in attack mode, crash into it, or attack over it, inflict them damage, you gain life points, and you get to special summon 2 more, so that's actually pretty nice. And then you really just have Sangan. You also have some plays, technically, where you can creature swap your opponent a Spirit Reaper and attack into it with Cyber Twin Dragon. That every now and again could come up. That used to be a win condition in other decks that had these 2. Basically, any time that these 2 cards are in the same deck, you need to be wary of that play. So it doesn't have a ton, but there are cards in the side deck, rather, that combine really well with creature swap. So I think partially a concession to the side deck is why creature swap's in the main deck. And then we have cards that are unique to Stein decks. These would not be in your traditional Chaos deck. We have Last Will, and then we only have 1 limiter removal and 1 Megamorph. You could only run 1 limiter, but you could technically run a full playset of Megamorphs. In the traditional Stein OTK that's fully committed, we basically cut these 4 cards. We basically cut the extra Megamorphs, the 3rd Stein, and the 3rd Giant Trunade. These 4 cards were cut in order to incorporate the Chaos package, or just basic 1-for-1 cards, or cards that are good outside of devoting yourself to the OTK, giving you a really reasonable plan B. Just play your non-Cyber-Stein cards really well, outplay your opponent, maybe grind them out a little bit, and win the game in the traditional sense. 1 Megamorph is interesting. A lot of these decks sometimes run 2 to give you sort of the 2-2-2 package of 2 Megamorph, 2 Stein, 2 Trunade instead of the full 3. I can understand only running 1, not wanting it to clog, right? Double Megamorph doesn't really do anything. Having limiter removal basically gives you the 2-2-2 package, and limiter removal is obviously just better than Megamorph because you have machines in the deck like Cyber Dragon and Dokoichi that could win out of nowhere. So I understand that decision as well. Last Will is an important one. I already commented how it combines with Exile Force. It also combines, and it's not super likely because this deck's only running 1 Zaborg, but one of the common plays throughout this time period in Yu-Gi-Oh's history involved your opponent going first, just setting a back row. Maybe they set a monster, set a back row, the traditional T set. And you have a bunch of cards that can clear your opponent's back row, MST, Trunade, Heavy Storm. And you go special summon Cyber Dragon because they have a defense position monster. Maybe they put something in attack mode. Maybe they summon Breaker and pass. Then you tribute the Cyber Dragon to Zaborg and you destroy their monster. And then you play Last Will, or depending on when the rulings were, you have to play Last Will first. But it doesn't really matter for what the point is that I'm trying to make. And then you summon Cyber-Stein and use Cyber-Stein's effect to summon Cyber Twin Dragon. And this directly is over 8,000 damage. So you can actually, through Last Will, special summon the Cyber-Stein because the Cyber Dragon went to the graveyard off the summon of Zaborg. This 3-card combo was a really frustrating one to lose to because you could theoretically lose on the first turn. But it's one of the main reasons why Last Will is specifically included in this deck. The last thing to comment on is the trap lineup. The trap lineup for this particular build is really simple. Decree is going to have a 2-fold effect. One, it's going to act as, obviously, a way of stopping your opponent with trap cards. And when you're trying to summon Cyber-Stein, obviously that makes a lot of sense. You're trying to push through. It acts as the 5th and 6th Heavy Storm / Giant Trunade effect. In addition to that, Return for the Different Dimension is one of the most popular strategies in the format. So you're hedging a little bit there. You're counteracting one of the most powerful cards in the entire format, while also making it more likely for you to win through Cyber-Stein. And again, this deck also just needs to push through damage early in the game because you're not always drawing Stein with Megamorph or Limiter. You're only running 1 of each. So in a lot of cases, if you just get an attack through with the Zaborg early, now Cyber-Stein's really live, just summoning Cyber Twin and attacking directly. So being able to push through damage and not having to worry about Torrential Tribute, Mirror Force, or any of those other cards, even Bottomless and Sakuratsu Armor, make it really useful and make it really valuable when you're trying to just push through damage. Then, as a concession to having space in the side deck, Corey elected to run mass board wipes in Mirror Force and Torrential Tribute, which were really borderline staples at this time period in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Even if you played Decree, even the decks were 3 Decree, they usually incorporated at least one of these. And if they didn't play 3 Decrees, they usually incorporated both of these, which is what Corey did. And having both of these in the main deck allows you to have a little bit more space in the side deck, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. Before I do get to the side deck, just really quick, the extra deck, you need Cyber Twin Dragons. Theoretically, the most you could summon is 2 with this deck. If all 3 Nimble Momongas resolve and you go above 10,000, you technically can Stein twice. So you need 2 of each of these. So 2 Cyber Twins, I have 3 here. I only have 1 Ultimate Cyber End Dragon, so I'm just going to show 1. But you would theoretically have 2. I only have 1 Ultimate Dragoon, but you'd have 2. You get the idea. I can't really think of a reason why you'd summon 2 Ojama King, so I guess you only need 1. Thousand Eyes was limited to 1, so you would use it. All the utility, sort of the GOAT format fusion monsters, Dark Balter, Senshi, Fiend Skull, Dark Blade, Last Warrior, Reaper, Dark Flare, Gatlin Dragon, and then technically the most attack that you could do is Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon. You know, let's say for whatever reason you can't deal damage with Cyber Twin, you need to attack over a monster to actually beat your opponent. The Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon was the highest individual attack output, so that gives us 4,500 attack output. But these are really the essential ones. You should have 2 of all of them. Maybe Ojama King is probably the only one that's a little questionable, though. I guess you could, summon 1 and then later in the game summon another. So 2 of all of those. The side deck needs to counteract a format where we are going to see Stein OTKs, like this one, are also versions that, again, hedge between Chaos and just actual OTK. We have the Kaiku version of the Chaos deck that we talked about with Banisher of the Radiance. We have the Recruiter version of this deck that we've talked about with Shining Angels, Mystic Tomatoes, usually Decree, but not always. And then, of course, we have the Return variants. So I've simplified that. I've yet to profile, though we'll eventually profile the Dark World version of Chaos. I think these are really the main decks. You could tell me there's Burn decks and Pac-Man decks and Reversal Quiz decks, but I don't think those decks are particularly great. Even, honestly, Tundo OTK, the Royal Magical Library deck, which I think I've actually previously brought out, so you could consider that, but we're not really siding against it. So these are the main decks. In terms of what we're trying to do, this is actually a transitional side, which is one of the strengths of this deck. If in game 1 you beat your opponent with Cyber-Stein and they bring in things like Wabaku or Karibo, you could really catch them off guard in game 2 or 3 because your side deck allows you to totally take out the Stein package and transition into something else. This particular type of transition allows you to play a Chaos deck game 2 or 3 because it incorporates more cards in the main deck that are just generically useful cards in the format, like Zaborg and Cyber Dragon and Dekoichi and Breaker. The other type of Cyber-Stein deck, totally devoted to the OTK game 1 with triple Trunade, triple Megamorph, triple Stein, just the full commit to the deck. Usually filled it out with stall cards like Swords of Revealing Light, Gravity Bind, Level Limit, Messenger Piece, so that the transition side didn't go into Chaos, but actually went into full-blown burn. So I'm talking about siding in Lava Golems and Stealth Birds, Desqualas, taking out the Stein package, not for a generic Chaos deck, but for a burn deck. The question of the merit there is a little bit interesting because Wabaku is obviously not great. Neither is Karibo against a burn strategy. So you have that benefit there of catching your opponent in this weird position, game 2 or 3, where they don't know if you're the burn deck or the Stein deck. I think this deck gives you a little bit more play. I don't know if I want to rely on a burn deck where I feel like if I have cards like Chaos Sorcerer and Zaborg, I'm a little bit more inclined to pull off victories in game 2 or 3 because I feel like those cards are just better than Desqualas. But nevertheless, let's take a look at what Corey ended up doing. Corey had 2 copies of Banisher, which is good against the Recruiter Chaos deck, so there's a concession there. He has an additional copy of Chaos Sorcerer and Zaborg, right? If we're basically turning into a Chaos deck, we want to bump up our Chaos Sorc count to 2 and then also Zaborg. So we've got those. We have, from that point, just a list of one-ofs that you would see in your traditional Chaos decks. We have Mystic Tomato, which goes really well with the Creature Swap. We have Tsukiyomi, which goes well with the Flip effects. It also goes well with the Creature Swap. We have a small package of Apprentice Magician and Old Vindictive Magician. I've commented on this package before as a good counter to the Banisher versions because Banisher, although it banishes or exiles or removes from play, Apprentice Magician still triggers when it's banished, so you can search Old Vindictive and counteract the Banisher. So this package was pretty good, especially if your deck had Recruiters in it. though this deck is more than likely going to side out the Nimble Manga game 2 or 3 if Stein's not in the deck. Then we have a second Spirit Reaper, which is obviously good with Mystic Tomato. We have DD Warrior Lady, which I think is an incredibly overrated card from an old school perspective, but I guess with Banisher, it's okay against the Recruiter deck, so there's one of those. There's also a Treeborn Frog, which might not make a lot of sense because this deck, at least in game 1, has the Decrees, but if you decide to side out Decree, which you would presumably do against a lot of matchups, unless maybe they're full-blown return, like triple return, you have 3 traps that you could side into, a Dust Tornado, Sakuratsu Armor, and Return from the Different Dimension, which would make it so that you get out a 5-card trap lineup and decide if you actually wanted to keep the Decrees in or not. And if your opponent's running Return and they see Decree game 1, they're actually probably going to cut some of their returns anyway. So you could take out the Royal Decrees on the assumption that they're cutting back on their traps and come into game 2 or 3 with this trap lineup. And then Scapegoat, which is obviously really good with enemy controller, which is the same thing you could say about Treeborn Frog, and then combines really well with things like Creature Swap as well. So just to show you a little bit of what I'm talking about with the transition side, if you're not familiar with that terminology, when you transition side, you're basically pinpointing cards that have a specific game plan in mind, game 1, that no longer do that in game 2 or 3. So I'm going to put Exile Force kind of in the middle here. So what I meant by that is in game 1, we are going to be playing cards like Megamorph and Limiter Removal that are devoted to OTKing the opponent through Cyber-Stein. But in games 2 or 3, we don't necessarily need to keep that package in. So if you take a look at the cards, we obviously have 2 copies of Stein. Those could come out. We have the 3 copies of Nimble. It's really not a good card, right? People aren't just playing Nimble Manga for no reason. So here's 5 cards we're siding out. We have these 4, so that's 9. And then the Decrees are questionable, and I probably would side out Last Will, because without Stein, I don't think it's great. And I actually don't think Exile Force is that great, especially if I'm siding out Last Will. So when you do that, you have 13 cards right here. Banishers are flex spots. So here's actually 13 exact cards. So if we put these into the main deck, now the rest of our deck is just sort of generically good cards, right? Enemy Controller's fine, Noblemans are good, Back Row is good, Back Row Removal rather. Book is fine, these cards are all fine. These are basically staples. Obviously Triple Cyber Dragon is good. Basically every deck at this time period played Triple Cyber Dragon. Dekoichis are in a lot of Chaos decks. We have 1/2 Chaos Sorcerers. Same is true with Zaborg. Faiths are basically staples at this time period. Morphing Jazz is a fine card. Breaker is fine, Reaper, Sangan, and then the 2 traps that are mass removal. So you theoretically combine this with this. There's no remnants of Cyber-Stein in our deck at all. And you could decide to put in the Banishers depending on the Royal Decree situation. Now, if your opponent is running the Recruiter deck with Decree, there's no reason for you to have Decree in your deck. So obviously that could open up some space too. So it really gives you a lot of flexibility there. And then you can side out other cards if necessary if you actually want to put in all 15. But having at least sort of 13 generically good cards, which is what we see here, it gives us that flexibility. The downfall and one of the side effects, really one of the drawbacks, honestly, of having a transition side is you don't target things as well. You don't necessarily have a great game plan against the mirror match, especially if they have the devoted Stein deck. You don't really have anything at all that you can side in that targets that, maybe other than keeping Confiscation in game 2 or 3. In addition to that, if you play against some of the other unusual combo decks, like the Royal Magical Library OTK, you don't really have anything targeted. I will say there was a good decision in a few spots to have cards like Dust Tornado and the flexibility of Decree, plus the main deck True Nades. It allows you against the trap decks, the burn decks, or any of the heavy trap decks to really pinpoint them, take care of them without having to side deck a lot, which I think is a really good idea. But nevertheless, this is Corey Fabish's first place Cyber-Stein Chaos deck from the YCS, or rather the Shonen Jump Championship in Hamilton from the summer of 2006. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! Content.